So what I'm going to talk about here for the next 90 minutes, guys, is something that's pretty obvious to everybody in this room, and that's the fact that technology changes, technology evolves. Now, the real challenge for us, though, is, okay, well, what do we do about that? You know, and the amazing thing to me is that technology, unlike a lot of things, doesn't age all that well. You know, one of the things I find really remarkable about being in this city is the fact that this tube system that we used to get around has been here a really long time. And it still works pretty well, you know, in general terms at least. Think about an application you wrote, say, 10 years ago. How's that looking today? You know, it's kind of crazy to me how quickly these things fall out of style. But the problem is that the risk of this old technology is very easy to ignore, right up until the moment where it can't be ignored anymore. And my organization is going through this right now. We're finally getting off Windows XP. Why? Because Microsoft finally said, yeah, we're not supporting it after this date, period, no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And we have some people who are still, well, I think Microsoft will still support us because we're a big customer. This is what then causes places like mine to launch these technology modernization programs where we pour a mega crap ton of money into fixing all the problems that we blissfully ignored for many, many, many years. And part of this, I think, frankly, is just the youth of our industry. We really haven't had to face some of these massive refactorings yet to the point where it's like, ooh, we really need to do something about that. I'll give you an example from my state. A few years ago, one of the major bridges in my state collapsed during rush hour. Now, luckily, the bridge was under construction, so there was significantly less traffic on it than there normally was. And so the death toll was relatively small. But it turns out when you knock a bridge down and people die, that's kind of a big deal. And it has spurred, not just in my state, but across the entire US, for people to finally re-examine bridges and finally understand, boy, we got a lot of bridges that need fixing. And we're going to need to spend some money on the infrastructure to do that. Now, unfortunately, those aren't sexy projects. That isn't the kind of stuff that gets you an award, and it's not a whole lot of fun. You know, it's a lot more interesting to open up a new bridge, or, you know, but the day in, day out maintenance stuff is still pretty darn important. Right, so how do we deal with that? You know, here's the reality, guys. I know nothing about roads. I don't know how to fix this, but I know it needs to be fixed. You know, I don't know at what point road engineers decide, you know what, we're just going to rip all this up and start over. But I do know that that problem does have to be fixed. It's obvious. It's visible to everyone. Our world doesn't work like that. The problems that we have, our customers can't see them. I have heard on more than one occasion a business, you know, customer VP type person say to me, what do you mean the code is old? How can code be old? It's not like it's rusting. And usually this gets followed by words that just make me cringe. But it works, right? Now, the proper answer to that is yes, but at a cost. And here's what that cost is. And when you continue to sort of limp along on these technologies, eventually the bill comes due, and it tends to be very large. So what do we do about that? Well, I think step one is on us. And I think it's very incumbent on us to keep up with the industry. Now, I'm preaching to the proverbial choir here because you guys are spending some time with us learning about new stuff. All right, thanks for doing that. But here's the reality, guys. There's a whole lot of bits out there, aren't there? I mean, we've had, what, 6 tracks going on here this week? Lots of different topics. It seems like every week somebody invents a new language or some new technique, some new approach, some new way we're supposed to do this. And that does put us into a challenge because how do you keep up with all that stuff? I mean, you can't possibly read it all. You can't possibly follow everything there is out there. Right? Now, some of you, I'm sure, read blogs or follow people on Twitter. Many of you buy books. We appreciate that, by the way. A lot of you, I'm sure, listen to podcasts, watch screencasts. Clearly, you guys have chosen to come spend some time with us. But the reality is this technology world is kind of a merry-go-round, isn't it? There is always something new. And it doesn't take long. You step back for 6 months, a year, and it feels like the world has passed you by. Now, here's the reality, guys. Your attention is the most precious resource you have, by far. Don't waste it. There was a great quote on this earlier, I think it was last year. Seth Godin put this out, and he said, it's a lot like real estate. Not making any more of it. except the value of your attention goes up over time. That's huge. The single best bit of advice I can give you in this world, guys, do not waste your attention. Now, the challenge here for you is you need to be selective. Now, there was a time in my life where I actually thought, oh, yeah, I can keep up, and that's no problem. But the reality is you cannot read everything. You just can't. There isn't enough time in the universe. I used to subscribe to a lot of magazines. And what they would do is they would pile up on the island in my kitchen. I would walk by the pile would fall over. I would get a look from my wife that suggested now would be a good time to clean up the pile. I would do so. And in general, what would happen is I would throw most of those magazines into the recycling bin because they weren't relevant anymore. I was in the same cube for a while at work, I think almost 3 years at one point, and when I finally got sort of ousted from that particular cube, I had accumulated enough paper to fill not one, but two 50-gallon recycling bins full of paper. Every one of those articles had something interesting in it. It was written by, smart people writing about useful stuff. There was a nugget in every single one of those. And I honestly thought, oh, well, that's good. I'll get to that at some point. Not so much. There was a point in human history where you could reasonably read everything. We do not live in that point in human history. Not even remotely close. The reality is you will miss virtually everything that gets published. Virtually everything. You have two choices here. You can cull aggressively the feeds that are coming into your life. And I use feed generically to mean, actual blog feed kind of things, Twitter follows, whatever you want to call it, magazines, articles, TV, et cetera. All that stuff is, anything that's causing or picking away at your attention. Or you just surrender to the fact that, you know what, I'm going to miss some stuff. And that's okay. The reality, guys, if something really, really important happens, you will find out about it. Now, I'll give you a US-centric example here. When the last presidential election happened, I stayed up to watch the final returns to come in. My wife is far more sensible than me. She went to bed. Do you think there was really any doubt within another day or so as to, did she know who the president was? Let's be honest, this is news that tends to travel globally as well. So you don't have to necessarily follow something that closely. You might be 24 hours behind, 48 hours behind, but in most cases, that's going to be reasonable. So maybe you don't hear about that new open source library the second it gets released. That's probably not going to be the end of the world. Now, my advice to you is to think long and hard about an information diet. So look at the things that you're interested in. Pick an area or two that you're really passionate about and go deep on that. Learn everything you can, read everything you can, follow everything you can on that. And by the way, this isn't a permanent decision. Right? There's really only a couple things you're ever going to do in your life that are really, truly permanent. Virtually every other decision can be changed. Now, at great cost in some cases. So pick something you care about, go deep, skim the other stuff. Be aware of it, but don't fixate on it, because there isn't enough time for you to be an expert on every possible single avenue that's out there right now. Now, I like to call this selective ignorance. Now, I'm kind of a front-end UI guy. That's where I like to live. So that's where I focus my attention. Kind of once things get to the server, I'm sort of not interested anymore. And, so I'm aware that there's these things called NoSQL databases and, beyond being able to throw out things like, Cassandra and Mongo and knowing that it's web scale. That's about it for me. I have friends that do know that stuff. And so when I have questions in that area, I ask them. And if there's something really interesting going on there, I rely on them to keep me in the loop, just as they rely on me for the things that I'm interested in. Now, the other side of this equation is, again, looking at the feeds that come into your life and prune them aggressively and viciously. It's very tempting, and I've tried. But at some point, you just need to accept, I haven't read this or watched this or even looked at this in weeks or months. I can probably delete it now. My wife and I have done this with our television viewing. I don't think we watch anything live anymore other than maybe like sports or the news. And even that, we usually hit pause when it starts so that I can skip the god-awful commercials. But almost everything else is on the DVR. And so for us, we'll see an interesting show. Oh, that looks kind of cool. Let's go ahead and record it. And then we let it queue up a little bit to see what happens. And usually one of a couple things. Either, wow, the reviews are coming in on it, and my friends are all talking about it. Absolutely, we're going to watch this. Or the other side of the coin is, gee, that's been on the DVR for 6 months. We haven't looked at it yet. We're probably not going to, are we? Yeah, okay, let's delete it. I like to say I'm late bound to pop culture. I like to wait and then see what goes on. So I didn't watch The Wire until it was all over. I didn't watch Breaking Bad until it was almost over. And now I'm desperately waiting for my wife to catch up so we can watch the last N number of episodes. There's a lot to be said for that. And actually, I've thought about this with my kid. He has no concept of a network television schedule. He's 6. The way his world works, you just say, I want to watch a show, and it appears. Now, eventually, we will actually have that, where everything will be available on demand. But for him, that's the world he lives in, right? Now, when you look at the feeds that are coming in, guys, if you're not reading it, it's okay to delete it. If something really interesting happens, it will find its way to you somehow. I can virtually guarantee that. Now, I'm going to show you a little bit of kind of behind the kimono. This is how deep my problem with this goes. This is out of my feed reader from some time ago. You'll notice that's a big number. Now, let's be honest. Am I going to get through 15,539 unread items? I mean, let's say, for the sake of argument, that I could take 2 weeks off and ignore my family, ignore all my work responsibilities, do nothing but read things that are in my blog queue here. At the end of that, I've read 15,539 items. Am I at 0? There's no chance, right? Because in that time it took me to read all those, people keep publishing more. Bastards. Now, the other side of this is taking advantage of the fact that a lot of folks have stopped posting. Blogs in particular seem to have kind of, died off a little bit. A lot of that attention seems to have gone to Twitter and similar types of things. So take advantage of the fact that your blogging tools will tell you, hey, these people haven't updated in years. There's a pretty good chance I can probably delete these, because if they haven't updated it in that long, they're probably not going to anytime soon. So it's probably safe for me to move on. Now, what I have finally moved to is what I call the A-B stream. And you may need a few different pieces on this, but I sort of modeled it after a coworker of mine, although I simplified considerably. I was with her on a project, and I looked over one day, and she had like 75 folders in her inbox, and there were like 500 unread emails spread across 75 folders. And I said to her, Raina, how do you manage all that? She said, oh, I have a lot of rules. I thought, I bet you do. What I've done is switch to what I call the A-B stream. And I've done this with my inbox too, but for the blog side of this, I have a folder called A. I'm very creative. It has about 24 blogs in it. These are the blogs that I care deeply about. These are the ones that I want to read. They have consistently shown me that they produce good stuff that's relevant to me, that's in my interest. I follow them very, very passionate. Everything else is in what I call the B folder. It's there. If I'm bored and I've gotten through the stuff in the A folder, then I go ahead and dip down into the B folder. Right. Now, you may want like a purgatory folder or a tryout folder or something like that. Maybe a new feed comes up and you're like, well, I'm not sure if this guy is quite worthy of being in the A box. Or, gee, this guy that I've watched for a while, really kind of phoning it in now. I don't think this is relevant to my life. I'm going to put him back into there and just see what happens. Maybe in a couple weeks, we'll go ahead and bump him up or delete him or move him into the B folder. Now, I take the same approach with email, at least at work. I have one folder at work. It's called Permanent Archive. That's it. When I get an email, I do one of a handful of things. Delete it, which is by far the most common thing. In fact, when I get back to my office next week, there's going to be a whole lot of deleting going on. Maybe I reply to it. Maybe I forward it. In very few instances, I dump it into the Permanent Archive. And one of these days, I'm going to go through the Permanent Archive with a machete and start dumping stuff that's more than N number of months old, because it's probably irrelevant at this point. Now, unlike my friend who has the very complicated folder structure, I don't have to put any thought into where an email belongs. I don't want to think about that. I'll take the hit when I go try to find it, as opposed to sitting there and looking at every email and going, does that go in the build folder, or does it go in the project folder because it's about that project's build? I don't know, maybe I should put it in both. Oh wait, I can't. I think another key aspect of this, guys, is to take advantage of whatever dead spaces there are in your day. All of us have periods of time where you got 10 minutes here, 20 minutes there. Use that to your advantage. Now, before we had these wonderful little pocket-sized computers, I used to print out articles and bring them with me to meetings because meetings never seem to start on time. And so I would take advantage of that few minutes before the meeting would start, and by the end of the day, I'd get 2 or 3 articles read. I try as much as possible to read things whenever I'm waiting somewhere, if I'm waiting for a friend or waiting for something to happen. My wife and I actually carpool quite a bit, and a few years ago, I had this boss that was really, really good at making sure I didn't get out of my office on time. I swear to God, he had like a little reminder on his calendar, Nate's getting ready to leave, go ask him a question. And so he'd show up at my cube, ask me this question, I'd answer it, I'd get out, and I'd be 10, 15, 20 minutes late. And I'd feel bad, don't get me wrong. And one day when I was particularly late, my wife was a little unhappy with me, and I suggested, honey, why don't you bring a book or a magazine, and when I'm late, you can read. That suggestion was not well received. But I've noticed a shift. In fact, just a couple months ago, I got a call from my wife, and she said, hey, I got out of work early today. I'm going to be to the queue early, but don't worry, don't rush. Just get out when you get out. That's fine. And I managed to get all my stuff wrapped up, and I was literally walking out the door as she was pulling up, and I hopped in the car, and she glared at me. And I thought, what did I do wrong? You didn't have to wait. And she looked at me, and she said, I was hoping to play a couple of games of cut the rope. Sorry, honey. Now, literally, when I go to the car, if I'm late, she's on her phone, checking Twitter, checking Facebook, checking email, whatever it is she's doing at the time. So she's finally taken my advice. Maybe. Don't tell her that. Take advantage of the dead space. If you've got a long commute, use that as an opportunity to listen to some podcasts, watch some screencasts, catch up with what you're doing. If you're going to go for a walk or a run or take the dog for a walk, use that as an opportunity to take advantage of that to sort of multitask a little bit. I spend a lot of time on airplanes, and I got to tell you, I don't particularly enjoy flying as such, but I really appreciate the 2 to 8 hours I have where I don't have to think about where we're going. I can just sit there and do what I want to do, and I've caught up on a lot of pop culture TV shows on transatlantic flights. I have a lot of friends today who don't read books, they listen to books. They do Audible or books on CDs. That's a big part of how they approach things. A friend of mine is a licensed pilot. He flies to a lot of the stuff that we do, and he's almost always listening to a book while he's in the air when he's doing that. Now, another thought here is examining your relationship with TV. Now, I don't have a good European number here, but I do have an American number. Anybody want to wager how much time the average American spends watching TV in a month? Hint, it's not small. It's 151 hours of TV a month. A month. It's darn near 5 hours a day. I actually just saw a stat earlier this week that said it's just over 4 hours of TV and 5 hours of other screen time. Now, it's not entirely clear to me what they're using for those numbers in terms of, obviously, like at work, we spend, 8, 10 hours in front of a screen. I don't know that that's what they meant. But it's kind of frightening how much people spend interacting with TV. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that's a bad thing. There are times in your life where vegging out is the only thing you can do. I have a bit of a guilty pleasure sometimes in a hotel room if I'm particularly zonked to watch really crappy TV. We all do that from time to time. But that translates just in the US to 200 billion hours a year. A year. To give you a context to what that means, that's 2,000 Wikipedias of effort a year spent watching TV. In a given weekend, people spend 100 million hours just watching ads. Just ads. That's a Wikipedia right there every single weekend on ads. That's stunning to me. And these are clearly people who have not heard of the DVR. Now, it isn't just TV. And again, I'm not trying to call out TV as being evil here. How many of you want to admit to playing this? Pretty sure I have every variant. They released a number, and this is a slightly old number at this point. It predates Angry Birds Star Wars, so it's probably low. But they said that there's 200 million minutes of Angry Birds played. Anybody want to wager what goes at the end of that? 200 million minutes a month? A week? Close. A day. A day. That's a lot of surplus right there. That translates, by the way, to about 16 years of Angry Birds played in an hour. Ponder that. So the amount of time you guys are going to be spending here with me, something like 24 years of Angry Birds will be played. It's possible some will be played right here in this room. Could happen. Again, I'm not trying to say that that's evil. I mean, there are times in our lives where your brain is just flooded. It's like, that's it. I can't do anything else. I just need to zone out for a bit, play a little Angry Birds or whatever it is. But it is surplus. And there is this debate right now in certain spheres that say, does the internet make us smarter or is it making us dumber? There's kind of two arguments here. There's Nick Carr on the one side. Nick Carr, by the way, is the Does IT Matter guy. And then there's Clay Shirky on the other side. Now, Nick's argument, and I'm going to belittle it a little bit here because I don't believe in it 100%. His whole thesis here is, I found that I'm having a harder time remembering things, and I've talked to some of my friends, and they're having a harder time remembering things, and while we admit we're getting older, it couldn't possibly be that we're having senior moments. No, what could it be? Oh, that's right, it's the internet's fault. Now, the one thing I will grant him is I have certainly found myself on more than one occasion, I'm reading an article, and you kind of get to this point where you're like, how much longer is this? You kind of scroll to see, well, is there 2 paragraphs or 20 paragraphs? And I guess if I'm being charitable, it's, well, maybe I want to read this later because I really should get back to doing some active work. But I'll be honest, sometimes it's just your attention goes blah and disappears. I don't believe we've reached the point where you can only do things in 140 characters. Although I can't remember the product, but somebody released a press release that was literally written in a style of tweets so that people who wanted to turn around and tweet about it could literally just go copy, paste, and bam, away you go. These were all written in tweet-size blocks. Now, Clay Shirky's argument, on the other hand, is, my God, you have the internet at your fingertips. You literally have the world's knowledge available to you pretty much any time of day, anywhere you go. Unless you're international roaming, in which case, you're going to pay an arm and a leg to use your phone the way you'd like to. But I've seen how this has changed my world. This happens to my wife and I seemingly about every week or so, maybe a little more often than that. One of us will ask a question. For instance, we were driving to this resort last year, and we drove through this place that had a sort of a military thing, and it was not a fort, it was a camp. It was Camp Ripley. And so I asked absentmindedly, I wonder why it's a camp and not a fort. So usually when one of us asks a question of that style, the other very quickly says, if only we had an internet-connected device. And then pulls out the internet-connected device and asks the question. But to me, that's a pretty amazing thing, that you can sit here right now and ask that kind of a question of your phone and get an answer. Now, what I am arguing is that you consider making small changes. Now, I'm not saying you should turn off your TV, get rid of your TV, cancel all incoming subscriptions and whatnot. But be more conscious about how you spend that time. And look at your day, look at your week. Can you carve out an hour here, a half hour there to devote to your craft? Now, we all have a lot of demands on our time. There's no getting around that. I have a family, a lot of us have families, and spending time with them is a pretty high priority for me. So what I try to do is, all right, until my kid goes to bed, I'm focused on playing with him and being there for him. When he goes to bed, if my wife's putting to bed, I use that time to sort of catch up on things a little bit. But think about your life. Could you take maybe an hour on Tuesday and an hour on Sunday morning or something and use that as your time to devote to the 1 or 2 areas that you're deeply passionate about? And then spend the rest of the time playing with your kid or hanging out with your friends or whatever it is that you enjoy. Now, that's an important part of this, but of course you need to make a conscious decision about, well, what should I pursue? And my answer to this is going to be pretty obvious. Well, what are you interested in? Because in order for you to carve out time, to take time away from your hobbies, your family, your friends, etc., it better be something that you find interesting. Again, getting back to me, if I tried to learn all about NoSQL, that would be really hard because, frankly, I just don't care. That's just not a part of software that interests me. You know, as far as I know, back-end stuff is a bunch of squirrels hiding nuts in a tree. As long as it performs, life is good. So for me to do that would be difficult. Now, learning about new front-end stuff, reading about usability, UI, things like that, that's easy. I can do that in a heartbeat. I've got no problem reading about that kind of stuff. Right? So pay attention to your interests. And again, remember, this is not a permanent choice. This might be for 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months, and then you may change your mind and do something totally different. That's perfectly fine. You do want to look a little bit at the value of the skills, although take that with a huge grain of salt. Because a lot of the things that we think are valuable may not be. And things that might really just be fun turn out to be super valuable in a year or two. Look at Objective-C. How many people 10 years ago would have even thought about looking at Objective-C? And now look where Objective-C ranks in terms of interesting languages. Well, maybe not interesting languages, but at least valuable skills to have. Now, part of what you need to balance here is the bleeding edge versus the trailing edge. And a lot of us very much prefer to be at the bleeding edge of technology. We don't really like to be in kind of that cleaning up the back end sort of stuff. But I'll be honest with you, there's a lot of money to be made on the back end. I worked with this guy early on in my career who literally from like the first day I met him had the retirement countdown screensaver going. And sure enough, a few days after that thing hit 0, he was out. We had his retirement party. You know, good working with you, Dick. Have a great retirement life. A year or two later, I'm walking through the building and I run into him. I'm like, Dick, what the heck are you doing here, man? I thought you were retired. He's like, oh, it's the damnedest thing. I'm working 3 days a week and they're paying me more than when I was a full-time guy. I said, well, that's great, Dick, you bastard. But here's the thing. Dick knew COBOL. He knew JCL. He knew IMS. He knew DB2. He knew where all the skeletons were buried, probably because he put them there. And so he was able to turn that into a very lucrative contract. Now, that wasn't a full-time, going to pay you till you die kind of a gig, but he made a lot of money cleaning up, essentially. Now, the real trick to riding a technology into the proverbial grave is you best know when to jump. And you probably want to be ready to jump a year or two before you really think that technology is no longer relevant. Because nothing is scarier than being an expert on something that nobody wants anymore. That's a bad place to be. Now, you want to balance the employability versus the enjoyability of it. And I sort of fall on the category that says life is short, so you're better off enjoying what you do. You know, the making money part usually kind of takes care of itself to a certain extent. So I'm a lot more interested, especially again when it's your own time, pursue stuff that you're interested in, pursue stuff that you're passionate about. And that tends to work itself very nicely into a way to pay the bills. Now, one way you can do this is with a technology radar. And this is an idea I steal whole cloth from the ThoughtWorks guys. And they publish this roughly quarterly. It comes out of their TAB, their Technology Advisory Board. And they started this originally as something for themselves, just to kind of get a sense of, you know, what's technology doing? And eventually someone said, hey, we should show this to customers, because this would be a good way to have that conversation with them about why they need to replace this infrastructure, why we're recommending this technology stack instead of that technology stack, et cetera, et cetera. And what it does better than anything I've seen is very clearly show you what is emerging and what is dying. Where do we need to be spending our money now? What should we be investing in? Now, from the high-level view, they have 4 different quadrants. They show a bunch of different technologies. Each ring kind of has a different meaning in terms of where things are. But you look at something like this, and you can get the same information in a spreadsheet. In fact, this is how it typically is done in most organizations. It looks something kind of like this. So which stuff are we investing in again, and which stuff is going away? Now, contrast that. This is the same data, but here I've laid it out in a radar. This is actually an old one from our world. And you can see we use this as a way of telling people, by the way, yeah, VB.net, older versions of .NET, older app servers, COBOL, etc. Yeah, no, that's on the way out. This is where we want to be. We want to be over here. All right, now the rings, as defined by ThoughtWorks, are hold, assess, trial, and adopt. So hold, that's the, man, this is still really early, or this is something that's on its last legs, it's dead. Next level in, we're starting to do some demos, proof of concept-y kind of stuff with it. You know, we're figuring out where it fits. Next step in, we're doing a pilot project with it. Real world project, so we actually understand what is good and what is bad about it. And then that inner ring, that means you should be using it right now. The best definition of the inner ring, if you're not using it, I get to make fun of you at the pub tonight. Now things will fall through the radar, and eventually, because otherwise that inner ring gets very, very crowded. You know, but the stuff that's just assumed today, like, you know, let's say subversion or something like that, it's like if you're not using some form of version control, we're definitely going to have a fun conversation at the pub. All right? Now, you can certainly modify this to your heart's content. There's nothing magical about the way they've described it. In fact, we changed it to contain, assess, early adopter, and general availability because that mapped more closely to vendor roadmaps that we get. Ironically enough, ThoughtWorks used to call the outer ring contain, but they renamed it because they thought that some of their customers would look poorly upon that when they saw most of their technology stack in the contain ring. Now, quadrant-wise, ThoughtWorks gives you 4: techniques, tools, platforms, and languages. I'll virtually guarantee you for your organization, you're going to want to modify that in some way, shape, or form. Right? You may discover that some of those just aren't relevant in your world. You don't have maybe too many techniques or too many tools. That's fine. We actually added one about frameworks, you know, because that was a big deal for us. We have a lot of different frameworks we use, so try to get a sense of what version of what framework should people be on, what should they be moving towards, et cetera. Now, I'm a huge believer you should build one of these for your company. It is not a hard exercise. It does not take that long. Literally what you do, go find a room with a whiteboard, get yourself a stack of sticky notes. I guarantee you have existing documentation right now. Most of it's very poor, very hard to get your head through. Start there and do your best. Now, I want to point out, this is a great opportunity to start bringing up some stuff that you find interesting that maybe hasn't quite bubbled up in your organization. So when I built our original radar, I threw things in there like Ruby, JRuby, Groovy, Grails, Gradle, et cetera, knowing that that wasn't technically on the radar, but I wanted to at least have the conversation. My hope, honestly, was I'd throw it on there and somebody would say, hey, what's that? Where are we using that? And I'd say, oh, well, here's what it is, and here's where it would be really useful. Try to spur somebody to move forward with it. So we did this a couple summers ago. We got into a conference room, threw this all up on the whiteboard. We literally took pictures of it with our cameras on our phones. We emailed that to various folks. They fed us some more information. We modified based on their feedback. And then we started showing it to people. We put it into, I hate to say it, but PowerPoint. PowerPoint's not generally a great word processing documentation, but it works pretty well for this. We started showing it to people. Now, my favorite aspect of this visual is that it works for everybody. It is one of the very few things I've seen in our world that works just as well for technology folks as it does for business folks, works great for developers all the way up to C-level type folks. It really does fit throughout the org, and that's really cool. Now, I think building one for your company is a great idea. It's a great use of some time. Again, doesn't take very long. I strongly advise you to make one for yourself. Put one together for yourself about what areas are you interested in, what kind of technologies would you like to pursue? What do you think is dying or emerging? Now, part of what we're trying to do here, guys, is play a little bit of portfolio theory. Again, you have a limited amount of time. And so in typical portfolio theory, what we want to do is put a good chunk of our money into the proverbial solid return category, something that we know is going to do pretty well over a long haul. And a certain percentage, depending on kind of your mindset, your appetite for risk, you're going to go ahead and throw out on a flyer. And if you lose it all, you lose it all. It's not going to be the difference between retiring or not. But it's there for maybe a little bit of fun, excitement, whatever it is. Now, I have a friend of mine who I would argue has done this perhaps the wrong way. When he left his big corporate employer, he rolled his entire retirement account into Apple stock. And for a long time, that looked really, really good. And at one time, he was talking to me, and he said, yeah, I've got the kids' education paid for. I thought, Jiminy Cricket, that's really risky, dude. But he did it. Wouldn't advise you to do that. Tech skills follow the same basic bucket. Right? There are certain skills we all understand that would be very solid today. You know, the Javas, the C Sharps, things like that, where you know you're going to be able to get a job if you know those languages. That's a good thing to have in your resume, no getting around it. But you want to spend some time thinking about the outliers, the sort of things that I'm really interested in that, and man, if they take off, I'd like to be somebody that's in a position to take advantage of that. You know, I know for a lot of folks in my circle right now, that would be Clojure. You know, that's getting a lot of attention. A few years ago, it would have been Groovy, Grails, Ruby, things like that, JRuby. Now, it can be really hard, though, to start kind of winnowing this list down, which is why litmus tests become really useful. So when I look at a piece of technology, you know, you've got to be able to sieve that out really quickly, and so I'm very curious about a few things right off the bat. One of the biggies is how do you test it? And I don't mean pitch it over the wall at QA and let them deal with it. What do I do as a developer to write automated tests against it so I get pass, no pass information really quickly? Pretty closely related is how do I diff it? By the way, that blows away a whole lot of tools right there, especially visual tools. We had this thing in the house for a while. It was all visual drag and drop, and the folks that were big proponents of it said, the best thing about it is you don't need any programmers. You just drag and drop these things on there. Even a business person can do it. And so when one of my guys got really excited about it, I said, well, that's really cool, man. So how do you diff it? And he's kind of looked at me. He's like, what do you mean? So, well, how do you tell what changes I made to this diagram? And I said, well, you can't. And he said, well, maybe you could print out a before and an after image and visually look at them. I said, no, that doesn't work. Of course, very, very closely related to this is how do you version it? And hopefully that doesn't mean, oh, the tool has its own versioning solution. No, how do I get it into Git? How do I get it into Subversion? That's vital. How do I automate it? Big believer in automation today. If you're doing something by hand, you're probably doing it wrong. You know, there's really only like 3 numbers in our world. It happens never. It happens once. Everything else. If you do something twice, you will do it 2 million times. So as soon as you've done it 2, 3 times, automate it. Find a way to automate it. We've had this argument a lot, especially in sort of the DevOps side of the shop. If you are sort of hand applying server updates, I'm very much of the opinion you're doing it wrong. This is the kind of stuff, there should be a script, you execute it, the script will always do the same thing each and every time. We as human beings will never do the same thing twice. We just can't. It just can't be done. It's very useful to look at your proverbial canaries. What are they looking at? One of the best uses of a conference like this is the hallway track. Talk to your peers. Figure out what they're interested in. What was the talk that resonated with them this week? Look at the agenda. Even the talks you didn't go to, the fact that somebody bothered to put a talk together on that topic means somebody has some interest in it. Does that have applicability to you? Now, for me, one of my canaries is Bruce Tate. And it's been really interesting to see the arc of Bruce's career through the books that he has written. You know, and it started out with Bitter Java, and then there was Bitter EJB, or Bitter Enterprise Java, whatever he called it, and then there was Beyond Java, and, you know, 7 web frameworks in 7 weeks, or however you phrase it. You know, and it's really interesting to see kind of how he has moved through the language and technology landscape. And if I had been a little more perceptive, I could have caught those trends myself. I'll give you my favorite example of this. Many years ago, I was at a conference, and the last talk on the last day was on Git. There's a good friend of mine who was giving it. I love watching him. He's an amazing presenter. And I looked around the room, and it was a small crowd, because it was, you know, last talk, last day, so everybody, you know, starts to kind of filter out. And Git at the time was a very esoteric concept. And there were as many speakers in the room as there were regular attendees. And the speaker pointed out, Stu pointed that out. I thought, okay, that's interesting. Now, had I been a little brighter, I would have caught on to that, and I would have invested deeply into the Git space at that moment. In fact, one of the guys that did was in that room. He's now GitHub's VP of training. Right? He was perceptive enough to figure that out. Now, when you look at cost, You have to think about cost in multiple ways. A lot of folks think it's just about, the license cost or that initial upcharge or something like that, or oh my God, we got to train developers. That's part of it, but that's not the most important aspect of it. Cost really boils down to, okay, what do we got to do to get started? How much is it going to cost to train people, get licenses, things like that? But then there's development cost. What's it going to cost to actually develop a solution in this? What's the cost to maintain solutions written in this? And what's the cost to deploy this? There are certain technologies, and we've used some of these, where the initial development time is pretty fast, but when you fire one of these things up in production, lights dim in the server room. Because this thing needs so much hardware to run, it's really expensive. So typically, and salespeople are brilliant at this, they focus on the lowest cost and ignore the other ones. But it's perfectly reasonable to bring in a technology that raises your training and getting started cost if it means we have less cost to develop, less cost to maintain, less cost for production. This isn't just a one number answer. Now, the other really interesting side of this, guys, is vendors aren't there to be your friend. They may take you out to lunch, they may bring you a bubble or something like that, that's cool. But the reality is, when you're dealing with a vendor, you are being played. Vendors and salespeople are professionals at selling to you. Much as you are spending some time learning about new technology with us this week, there are salespeople who are attending conferences learning how to sell to you. This is how they eat. They're very, very good at it. I did this procurement earlier last year, and after one of the meetings, our procurement person pinged me, and she's like, I don't think this vendor has our best interest in mind. And I had to bite my tongue because I'm thinking, really? What vendor does? I mean, let's be honest. The vendor's job there is to make a sale. And yes, they want you to be happy, or at least satisfied. Please don't come sue us. But push comes to shove, they're focused on selling to you. Now, the challenge here is these salespeople, these sales engineers, they're going to try to give you the veneer more than anything else. The challenge for us is to try to move beyond that and to ask the more probing questions. So we had this product in the house a couple years ago, and at a surface level, yep, it supports this particular, I can't even remember what WSRP is from a standard standpoint, but it was a way of consuming Java portlets. Right? So we get it at the technical side saying, guys, go implement this. Okay. Well, a few days into it, we figure out that the implementation of that spec was old and non-compliant anyway. So from a sales guy standpoint, they didn't lie to us. They told the VP, yes, it does have WSRP support. But that wasn't a deep enough question. That's where they needed someone like us to be in the room to ask the more probing question. What version of WSRP does it support? What does that actually look like? Now, one of the most dangerous things you will ever hear from a salesperson is, yeah, it's customizable. This way lies great pain, and is generally just a wonderful way to transfer wealth from your company to theirs. I'm of the opinion you need to pick your poison. If this software is key core to your business, this is part of your strategic advantage, build it, own it, make it yours. If it's not, if it's ancillary, secondary, buy it. As soon as you mix the two, dangerous waters. The odds of you getting your return on investment are incredibly low. Now, the sales folks for these organizations are going to love you because they get a subscription off of you. They're going to have their consultants there for months or years. So that's a win for them. They just got a new boat. You, on the other hand, are stuck. Fowler calls this package customization, and it is evil. Now, you need to look at the skill sets of your developers, and this is an important part of understanding your organization. What can your organization handle? Some companies are much more interested in being on the cutting edge. Others, until it's a third generation and it's a Gartner Magic Quadrant and it's been on the cover of CIO magazine, we don't even consider it. I'm not as worried about skill sets because I'm of the opinion that developers are smart people and we can teach developers the skills we need them to have. So when I interview people, I'm really not super concerned about what they know right now. It's, can you learn new things? Can I teach you what I need you to know? But consider the folks you want to hire. This is at least part of why we moved pretty heavily towards jQuery. It doesn't take very long of continually getting people that have jQuery experience to go, we should probably adopt jQuery, shouldn't we? Because that's what people seem to know. I think it's much more important now to take a step back and ask yourself, well, does this actually fit in the organization or not? And this is where we have to utter this really ugly word called politics. And I would like to tell you that the hardest technical problems we face are technical. They're not. They're political. So you have to understand your organization. Are they going to accept these ideas or not? They may not. It depends. Some organizations are very conservative. They don't want to move very quickly. Others, oh my God, it's 1.0, it's legacy, we need to get off of it. So ask yourself, what are some of your litmus tests? What are some of the things that you look at to quickly make a decision about technology A versus technology B? More interestingly, look at your company. What litmus tests do they seem to apply to these decisions? And do those map nicely to each other or not? And if they don't, what does that mean to you? What does that mean to where you're at in that organization? All right, so we've figured out how to keep up. We've carved out a little time. We've looked at some things. We know we want to learn about X, Y, and Z. Now we want to bring it into the company. How do we do that? Go get that radar. Use the radar as a way of introducing these ideas into your company. Again, it's an outstanding visual. It's a very easy way to visualize the potholes, to show people what they actually look like. Another way to think about this, something I'm a big fan of, is gap analysis. So instead of just saying, we need to bring in this new library, identify what things you can do today and what things you can't do today. So I brought in a bunch of new JavaScript tools this summer, and a big part of how I was able to sell that was by doing a gap analysis to say, well, you know, we have a testing tool, but it doesn't do A, B, and C. And it's hard to do D, E, and F. And we don't have anything to do these capabilities. And so now you can start mapping other libraries in there. It makes it a lot easier instead of because what most business folk, what most VP folks hear when you say, I want to bring in something new is, great, he's found a shiny new toy to play with. You're going to get it in, you're going to play with it for 2 weeks, get bored, move on to something else, and then I'm going to be left with this pile of stuff to maintain that you're the only one that understands it. And the natural response to that is going to be no. So you have to show how it's actually going to make life better. Now, the other thing we're trying to do here is actually quantify the risk and get people to actually understand the old way isn't free. What does that cost us? I did some work a couple years ago trying to help us get ready for Windows 7, and one of the things I discovered as I was sort of nosing around is we had an application that ran on a Palm Pilot. And I talked to the tech lead. I'm like, dude, seriously, a Palm Pilot? He's like, yeah, I know. We've been trying to get rid of it, but you know, it's a sunset thing, and so they won't move any faster than they have to. Like, well, you do realize that Palm doesn't exist. It's like, yeah, I know. What happens if they drop the Palm Pilot and it breaks? I said, they have a spare. Does the spare work? What happens if it doesn't? Can we replace it? We found instances where we were using software that had been bought 4, 5, 6 times by different vendors. It wasn't even clear who owned it anymore, whether or not we still had support, whether or not it was still even a legitimate version. Those are really, really unpleasant conversations to get into. It's always interesting to ask about your bus number, or if you want to be more positive, your lottery number, which is to say, how many parts of your application, if one person left tomorrow, you'd be just totally hosed. I worked at a company for a couple years where this was endemic. There was a bunch of people who had essentially built little foxholes in the code base. And they literally, it's like, he's the one person that understands the ORM layer. He's the one person that understands the client layer. He's the one person that understands how RMI works in this part of the app. And from their standpoint, I understood it, because this company had kind of gone through this back and forth. We'd hire a bunch of people and fire a bunch of people, hire people, fire people. And so they did it for self-protection. But that's a failure of management. And eventually, someone shows up who recognizes that and fixes the problem. And when you're the one guy that knows the ORM layer, and now you've switched over to the new one that 3 or 4 or 10 people know, you're not necessary anymore. and you're usually one of the first people to get shipped off. The other big downside of that is if you're the one person that knows that, your vacations are, don't forget your phone and your laptop, because you can't leave, because if something bad happens, we need to be able to reach you. Vendor support is always interesting. Do they still support it or not? They might not. A lot of times those support contracts don't run anywhere near as long as we actually use software, and that's a risk. And I'm okay with people doing that as long as they understand that and acknowledge that. We had some folks earlier this year that were using an open source version of a library that we had paid for a commercial version, and they were very hesitant to move because they didn't want to do another round of testing. And I kind of looked at my boss and said, well, what do you want to do about this? And he said, well, as long as they basically get sign off from somebody high enough up on the business side that, yes, I acknowledge and accept this risk, that's fine. But understand that there's going to be a group of lawyers that's going to come down on them like vultures for doing that, because that license opened us up to things that they weren't comfortable with. We had one app I ran into where the person said to me, well, it's only 3 users, it's not that important. So I asked a very natural follow-up. I said, great, what would happen if it stopped working tomorrow? They kind of paused for a second. They said, oh, well, we wouldn't be able to create any new forms. I said, well, is that a big deal? How much would that cost us? And they said, yeah, that'd be really expensive. That'd be millions and millions of dollars. I said, okay, well, then it's irrelevant that it's only 3 people. It's the business value that that application provides that matters. This is a hard one. Most companies will happily continue to throw good money after bad. Well, this product really sucks, but you know what? We've already come this far, so let's keep pouring money down that rabbit hole. It'll work this time. That's brutal. It's hard to do that because typically what happens here is somebody is going to lose face. Somebody's going to have to admit that they pushed something for political reasons, not technical reasons. It wasn't a great, didn't really have a CBA, whatever it was. That's not always fun. Now, when you bring in a new product, guys, you must acknowledge the negatives. This is if you bring something to me, I guarantee you I'm gonna poke at this. Because there is no such thing as a perfect technology. Nothing is a silver bullet. Nothing is magical unicorn fairy dust. So I'm gonna ask you 2 very natural questions. What do you like about it? This will be easy to answer. Because if you're bringing something in, there's gotta be some reason you like it. The more interesting question, the one that I really care about, is what don't you like about it? And you better have some answers to this. Because if you don't, that tells me you haven't done anything with it. If you haven't done anything with it, well, I have to start taking everything you say with a huge grain of salt. Now, whenever I interview people, one of my favorite questions, and I got this from a friend of mine, I stole it whole hog. Let's say you're a Java person. I'd say, great, that's really cool. What would you add to Java? You can add any feature you want to Java. However, you must remove a feature first. What's it going to be? You're king of Java for a day. Now, usually when I ask this, people sort of hem and haw a little bit, and some even say, wow, it's a really hard question. Can we talk about how many potholes there are in Seattle instead? Those wonderful, crazy interview questions. I'd much rather answer one of those. But this, to me, gets deeper into it. And we interviewed a guy a while ago, and I was asking this type of question. I just never got a good answer to it. And for me, that was a deal breaker. And I've had at least one time where this has turned into my favorite answer, which is a 45-minute conversation with somebody that you won't let leave the room. In most cases, you will be disappointed. Right, so if you're bringing in a new technology, what do you like about it? What don't you like about it? How does it look next to its alternatives? Because there have to be alternatives. I mean, that is almost a given. And this is where, and I hate to use these because I think they're kind of evil, but spreadsheets can be your friend. You can use spreadsheets as a way of comparing things. So, you put some options across the top, put some criteria down the left. Now, you can certainly weight the criteria as needed. Could look something a little bit like this. I sort of blotted out the examples. It doesn't really matter. But we went ahead and weighted things various ways, and you get scores out of that. This is another example we used where it's like, okay, we've got these different capabilities and what they mean and how these various options score. Now, you can use Harvey balls, too. This is something we're particularly fond of. I've got one VP where he eats these things up. So if I'm going to give him anything, there's going to be a Harvey ball in there somewhere. That's these little guys. Right, so not at all the way, somewhere in between. This is a lot easier to discuss than, well, it's a 1. Well, I really think it's a 2. Well, it's a 1.5. Oh, what's that mean? Right? So what we're really trying to get at is how closely does this map? And again, this is a very, very effective way of visually looking at these things. Now, the criteria is up to you. How you weight them is up to you. And it is very, very tempting to stack the deck in the favor of your desired outcome. If you do this in a particularly ham-handed way, it will be obvious. And that almost always results in the opposite answer than what you want. Because as soon as somebody sniffs that that's what you did, they're like, I wonder what else you've done here. Clearly, I'm going to choose a different answer because you weren't able to honestly let these two look at each other straight up. I was involved in an analysis at one point. We got together as a big group, and we were going to choose between like 4 or 5 different kind of web front-endy kind of things. And we were going to get together in a week and discuss it more. And when we got together in a week, 2 of the senior guys had gone off and done their own evaluation, and sure enough, the internal tool somehow came out on top. Like, really? How convenient. So be very, very careful with having your desired outcome happen by manipulation. I'm a huge believer in book clubs. I have yet to work someplace where they wouldn't give me books. Now, it might take some arm twisting. Come on, give me books. Usually, eventually, your manager will just say, okay, fine, here's 10 books just to shut you up and get you out of my office. This is by far the cheapest and easiest way to introduce new ideas. All you got to do is pick a book. And by the way, this is a great way. Let's say you're really interested in learning more about continuous delivery. You want to read, the Continuous Delivery book by Jez Humble. But boy, I don't know how I'm going to find the motivation to do it. Get a group of your peers together. Every Monday in the morning or at lunch or whatever, we're going to get together and we're going to go through a chapter and go for it. Now, in a perfect world, our book club duties would rotate from person to person. And, okay, I'll take chapter 1, you take chapter 2, you take chapter 3. I've never seen that actually work. Almost every book club I've been involved with, there's 1 or 2 people who are truly passionate about it, and then a set of other people of varying levels of interest. There's nothing wrong with you just taking ownership. And yes, I'm the book club leader. I'm going to be the one leading the discussion every week. That's perfectly fine. You can be kind of selfish about this. If this is what it's going to take to help you get through some of this material, go for it. Now, I sort of feel like I'm, again, preaching to the choir. I mean, you guys are sitting here listening to us go blah, blah, blah this week, but this is an important thing. There's a lot of value in getting together with your peers for a few days and sharpening the proverbial saw. What you should do after an event like this is take a step back, look at the agenda, and say, okay, what are all the new ideas that I didn't think about before I got here this week? What are the 1 or 2 things that really stood out to me? And how should I be approaching that? Again, there's a lot of value, even in the talks you didn't have time to attend, to say, okay, maybe I should explore this deeper. Talk to each other. That, to me, is one of the biggest benefits of a conference, is you are surrounded by hundreds of your peers. What are you guys interested in? What are you guys looking at? What got you fired up this week? Now, if you're really looking for motivation, if you're really, God, I so want to learn more about NoSQL or Angular or whatever it is, volunteer to give a talk. I can virtually guarantee you somewhere near where you are, there is a user group that is begging for speakers. And I understand this is a scary side of the podium to be on. It is not a natural thing to get up in front of your peers. But it is the best way I know to motivate yourself to learn something new. Now, if that's too scary, if the idea of getting up in front of dozens and dozens of people is not something, or hundreds of people that resonates with you, give a brown bag at work. You've now lowered the formality considerably. Now it's maybe 8 or 10 of your peers. It's nowhere near as scary as being at your local user group or a conference or something like that. Now, I'd like to say this has no bearing on anything we do and that everything is a pure meritocracy that's all just about how the tech stacks up against others' tech. It isn't. It really isn't. I'm sad to say that. A lot of these things, guys, boil down to relationships. A lot of those relationships have nothing to do with the office. They take place outside at golf courses or private clubs or over wine or scotch or something like that. And this is where you need to do some stakeholder analysis. You need to understand who you're pitching to. and ask yourself very honestly, all right, what's important to them? Are they really, really interested in cutting costs? Are they interested in code quality? Are they interested in uptime? Are they really in the sway of a vendor and they just want a turnkey solution? What's their background? Are they technical? Do they have a degree in computer science? Do they have a master's in software engineering, something like that? Or are they more from the business side? You know, the VP in my chain right now, he's a former geek. I can talk to him about things that I can't talk to one of his reports about because he's much more of a business-oriented guy. Nothing wrong with that. You know, they both have sort of different purposes, so to speak, within the organization. But the way I talk to Ken, the type of message I need to present to him, is going to be different than what I would give to Vincent. That's just understanding my audience. Right, so what are they concerned about? What gets them up in the middle of the night? What are they thinking about first thing in the morning? You know, what are they influenced by? We've got some folks in my organization, it's all about what the analysts say. It's all about Gartner and Forrester and all those guys. And it's like, well, if it isn't a magic quadrant, we don't even consider it. Who are they influenced by? This is one of the most critical things for us to learn as we evolve in our career. I would love to be able to just walk into a room and say, you should all do what I say because I'm smart. It doesn't work. You have to influence the influencers. I can't influence my CIO, not directly. I can influence my boss. My boss can influence the CIO. So if I want to get something done, I focus my effort and energy on Jeff, knowing that Jeff will have to carry water to the next level. So part of my job is, how can I shape a message that I know he can easily take to his boss? It's a key part of this. Now, I'll give you another example of this. Now, my son, when he was at his previous daycare, one of the rules was when you drop him off in the morning, you're supposed to wash your hands. Now, as a dad, I have this, some would say, insane belief that I should be able to tell my child what to do and he should listen because I'm his dad. So we'd go there in the morning and say, Everett, wash your hands. And, of course, his answer was, no, usually followed by, never. Now, as a dad, I'm like, all right, I'm going to puff out my chest, wash your hands because Dad says so. Never works. Now, my wife, she's much, much smarter than me, so she would look at my son and she'd say, you know what, Everett? I bet I can get my hands washed faster than you. And he would take off like a shot for the sink and he'd be washing his hands, ha, 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 Mommy, I beat you. And she would just nod and say, yes, yes, you did. Now, the scary thing is, guys, you might need to put on your pointy-haired manager hat and consider things from their standpoint. What are they interested in? What are they worried about? You know, we come along and we throw out some new language like Clojure or something, and we think that's no big deal. We're just going to add a jar to the proverbial class path. It's going to help with concurrency, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's not what our managers hear. In their mind, they hear Clojure and they go, oh, my God. You've just blown up my world. I got to hire all different people. I got to get new servers. No, this is risky. So be honest. Is it? It might be. Are you just chasing a shiny new toy? It's possible. You need to be a Boy Scout. The trick for us is to be prepared for these conversations, to have our arguments ready, so that we can have that discussion with our customers, with our folks that we need to pitch this to. It is possible that there is a very rational reason for the current state. I'm willing to believe that. Now, it may not always make sense from our standpoint. You know, in Return of the Jedi, there's this scene where Luke is kind of giving Obi-Wan some grief, saying, dude, you know, you told me that Darth Vader killed my dad, not that he was my dad. I'm sorry if that's a spoiler alert. And Obi-Wan's response is, what I told you is true from a certain point of view. So I got in an argument with one of my VPs about this particular vendor, and I said, my God, they're so much more expensive than this other vendor, and never mind they're developer hostile. And he said, yeah, but the advantage of that vendor is we snap our fingers and 100 consultants show up, and they're free. And I looked at him and I said, dude, you know they're not free. He's like, well, yeah, I guess you're right. But from the point of view of the people signing the contract, they're free. Again, guys, the technology stuff, that's easy. Culture is hard. Culture kills. Culture is where good ideas go and crash upon the rocks. Because here's the reality, guys. We are flawed creatures. We are irrational creatures. At a certain point, you just need to accept that I don't understand why we're using this particular technology or product or feature. It doesn't make sense to me. If you overthink it, it will eventually drive you nuts. At a certain point, you need to ask yourself, are they buying what I'm selling? So I spent quite a bit of time a year or so ago fighting this particular product that was being brought in, and I lost because people much higher in the org chart wanted this. So there was nothing I could do to actually stop it. So the best I could do, and I think I was fairly successful here, was to try to make it as easy for the folks that had to use it as possible, and more importantly, to make it as easy for us to get rid of that product as possible should we choose to do so at some point in the future. Now, the other side of this, guys, is people will push back. I can absolutely guarantee you, no matter what you're trying to do, no matter how amazing you think what you're bringing in is, how much of a no-brainer it is, people are going to push back on you. Because the reality is people just fundamentally don't like to change. This is not comfortable for us. We get into our routines. We like to stay in them. Right? Machiavelli was dead on about this. Because here's the thing. You're bringing in something new, something innovative. And the folks who were doing really well in the old system are going to fight you just because they like the way things currently work. And everybody else is going to sit on the sidelines and wait. And they are not going to commit until they absolutely have to. Because should things go south with the new approach, they want to be able to say, yeah, see, I knew it was never going to work. I was against it from the beginning, even though they were silent. Reputations are going to be at stake. In a lot of organizations, especially as you get higher up, that's what it's about. It isn't about your technical prowess anymore. I guarantee you people are going to throw fear, uncertainty, and doubt at you. They will sow that, especially the sales guys. They're brilliant at this. This is what really separates the great salesmen from the so-so ones. The really good salespeople figure out very quickly what are the buttons that I need to press on the person sitting across the table from me. Oh, you guys are looking at that other product. Well, do you know they got hacked the other day? Yeah, it turns out they're not so secure. Oh, it's too bad. We're secure, though. Oh, yeah. They're really good at ferreting that out. They're a lot like, the proverbial people reading your palms, who are just like, oh, yeah, so you lost a parent, right? Oh, yeah, your dad. Yeah, that's what I'm seeing. They do the same thing. So be prepared for that. Understand what they're going to attack and be prepared for that. What are you going to do to counter that? One of the best things you can do, guys, is to take a look at what the current approach is costing you. I call this a pain register. So we did this a couple years ago. Our laptops were getting really old and crufty. And so we kept track of how much time we spent waiting for our machines. And it didn't take very long. Within a few weeks, we had real data, a real dollar amount. And that's a story that our management can sell. So we hand them a neat, tidy bow saying, you can save the company literally thousands of dollars if you get us new laptops. And then they can go take that to their boss and take credit for saving the company money. It's a lot harder to argue with data as opposed to sitting there and whining. I need a faster laptop. Why? Because I need a faster laptop. What's there to understand? So we figured out very quickly that laptops were costing us at least 2 hours per developer per week. That takes very little time to pay for itself. Before, boom, yep, no problem, they're on order. You guys will get them by next week. Sadly, you may have to do the wrong thing first. You may be stuck doing it that way because someone bought the product, someone, again, they have to prove that this is the right choice, and they'll shove you down that path until they can find a good way to sort of duck out. Either they get promoted or they move on to a different project, and now it becomes politically feasible to slide into a different direction. Now, you can use opportunity costs as part of this. You can say to people, well, by doing this, we're missing out on this. Is that a bigger opportunity for us? Is that a bigger value for us than doing it this way? what are your competitors doing? Now, this is kind of a double-edged sword because understand, your competitors have absolutely no incentive to tell you why they're beating you. They're not going to. And I always get disappointed when people are like, well, we want to be just like our competitors. We want to use the same kind of technology. We want to be commodity, whatever. It's like, well, great. Then you can never be any better than they are. So if your goal is truly to exceed them, then you, by definition, have to do something different. This one's hard for me. Sometimes you have to listen. You need to look at things from your management side of view and say, all right, well, what are you guys concerned about? How can I phrase my stuff into language that you're going to understand to show that, hey, I'm actually trying to help. I am trying to make things better based on the metrics that you care about. Because there are legitimate issues here. And it's very tempting for us to just try to dismiss them. Oh, those aren't important. But they are. They are to that person. And if that person's the gatekeeper, you better address those issues no matter how trivial they seem to you or how non-important they seem to you. And this does mean you're probably going to have a conversation. Now, I know how a lot of us think. We're geeks. We're smart. We think we should be able to go in a room and just tell people, do what I say because. It doesn't work. Just like with my son, I can tell him to wash his hands, or I can dare him to wash his hands. So look at your communication style. How are you communicating with these stakeholders? Are you being respectful? And as much as we don't like titles and think it's kind of silly, there are folks in organizations who insist, hey, I'm a VP. You need to be more respectful of me purely because I'm a VP. Right? Or are you being very cynical and derisive and using sarcasm? So be honest. What's going to work better? How do you shape your message for that audience? Now, change is a tricky thing. There's no getting around it. I'd love to be able to just snap my finger and things would be better. But habits, let's be honest, they're hard to break. A lot of folks make New Year's resolutions. How many people just keep the same sheet year after year after year? It's a lot easier that way. Just pull it out of the drawer. Because it's hard to change. There's no getting around it. Now, there's really two ways of doing this. You can force people to change. You can use a hammer and say, you will do this or else. Or you can do the ninja approach. Again, going back to my son, I can try to force him to wash his hands, or I can turn it into a game. It's much more effective when I act like a ninja. Plus, the outfit's a lot cooler, right? You can't force people to change. You just can't. It doesn't work. Anybody who has a significant other in their life gets this. You may think you can make them a different person. It ain't going to happen. You can influence, though. You can nudge them in the right direction. So a friend of mine had a great quote on this. He said this to me at one point. I thought it was really brilliant. He said, the change must happen with people, not to them. Far too often, we try to force people to change. We go in and say, you will adopt Agile. You will adopt this language. Why? What's in it for me? Because remember, in most organizations, we've got people who have been doing things, and they've been successful, in some cases, for their entire career. They are, by definition, going to be skeptical of you. I've seen this. We were at a company picnic this summer, and I was talking to some folks that I'd worked with at the beginning of my career, and they were switching over, and they were doing Agile, and you could tell they're like, yeah, I'm in a project room now doing this Agile thing. And they were in a position where they were forced to do that. I guarantee they're not going to be as successful as if someone had sat down with them and helped them understand, hey, this is what we need you to do, and this is why. This is how it's actually going to be better for you. Got to build up some trust. Change is really hard to maintain because inevitably when we try to change something, we get worse before we get better. And when we get worse, it's really easy to scurry back to the way things were and go back to what we were doing. Seth Godin calls this the dip. So we've got the current status quo. We all realize we want to get to the new status quo. But to get there, we're going to be worse for a while. And so if not everybody's on board with this and you haven't done a good job of explaining why the new status quo is going to be better, when things get worse, this is when folks run back to their manager and say, oh my God, have you seen all the new defects we have? This new approach is horrible. We need to go back to the old way and have a separate QA department, blah, 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 blah. Getting through the dip is hard. Pushing through the dip is hard. This is why this is why the sledgehammer approach is so unsuccessful. Now, the other really tough thing here, guys, is change takes time. I am not a patient human being, and I just want to be able to snap my fingers and have everything be different, but that is not how the world works. Organizations take time to change and evolve. People take time to understand what's going on, build trust with this approach, adapt to this approach. And here's the reality. You may want to change everything all at once. That's a great way to make sure you fail. If you try to change every single aspect of your organization in one fell swoop, I can guarantee you failures on the other side of that experiment. So you need to be real honest and ask yourself, all right, what is it we need to change? What's the either low-hanging fruit or what's going to give us the biggest bang for the buck? Work on that and then rinse, repeat. If you try to change everything at once, failure is a guarantee. You know, this reminds me a little bit of kind of how we all learn to walk. You know, a lot of us have clearly forgotten that. We didn't just get up one day and go, oh yeah, I like this walking thing. This is a good way of getting around. We worked our way up to it. We rolled, we crawled, we sort of stumbled along holding on to stuff, and throughout that process, we fell a lot. But eventually we got the knack of it. My son took the training wheels off his bike this summer, largely because the neighbor kid was riding without training wheels. And since Leo's the same age, this became a competition. And for the first couple days, it was pretty rough. The kid fell. And he wasn't so happy about that. We had a lot of hard conversations. Hey, buddy, this is how it works. You're going to fall. This stuff isn't easy. I wish it was. I wish I could give you the recipe that you can apply, the template, and this will all just work. The best advice I can give you is take a look at books like Switch. There's another one about, I think it's The Power of Habit, where we get into these kind of things. And what's really cool about Switch is it talks about the rider, the elephant, and the environment. The elephant is your habits. You know, let's say you're going to try to eat better. Well, your elephant wants to eat a donut. Your rider has a certain amount of willpower and can kind of, shove the elephant over a little bit, but eventually the rider gets tired and the elephant wins, and you're going to eat the donut, especially if the donut's in the house. My wife and I have had this conversation. She's had times where she's like, my God, why did I eat that? And it's like, well, if you spend all day making decisions and doing hard mental work, you deplete your brain's ability to make decisions. And so then when you're faced with, well, I really should have the broccoli, but boy, that looks tasty, you're going to eat the tasty thing. Sometimes you just have to dive in and do it and see what happens. There are times where that is your only option. If you really, truly feel strongly about something, you may have to do it on your own time. You may have to do it, after work, on the weekends, to prove that this is the way to go. A few years ago, one of my guys did this experiment. They were building an application in one framework, largely to prove that that framework was not a good way of building CRUD apps. He built the same functionality in Grails, and it literally took him about 2 days to do what this team of people had done in a month. And I had hoped that that would get the attention of folks higher up in the org chart to say, wait, you did what and how fast? And how can I have more of that? Because in general, it is very hard to argue with that kind of data. Not impossible, unfortunately, but harder. Now, I know for some of us this is borderline four-letter word territory, but let's be honest. How are the products we're looking at marketed? And in some cases, more interestingly, to whom are they marketed? Now, you may want to believe that you're the target audience for a lot of these things. In many cases, we're not. They're actually being pitched at folks above us in the org chart. And I've had VPs come to me and say, well, we went with that vendor because they speak better exec than the other vendor did. That, to me, is one of the worst possible reasons to make a technical decision I've ever seen, but it happens. Now, how you communicate turns out to be much more important than many of us ever gave it credit for. And I hate to say it, but how you present matters, especially as you move your way up in an organization. Now, a couple of friends of mine and I spent an awful lot of time talking about this. We wrote a book on it, Presentation Patterns. How do you present to people? Because here's the reality. Give the same message to folks and make it, kind of like a rose, nice and perfumey and whatnot. versus a really crufty looking thing, people are going to resonate better with the better crafted message. But you have to look at your organization. What works in your organization? Be honest about that. Is there a pain point you can throw at your organization to say, this is something I can solve? Again, it kind of gets into that capability gap matrix concept. In a perfect world, you can tie the thing you're trying to bring in back to some high-level executive goal. I did this a while ago with some code quality kind of stuff. It was a bit of a stretch for sure, but I was able to map the use of Sonar and Jenkins and things like that to an overarching C-level goal of having more consistent, better, stable releases. Say, well, if you want that, then what you really need are these things up front to enable that. So I used that as my excuse, and my build guys, my DevOps guys, they threw that on the server in less than a day. If it had just been, well, I'd like it because I think it's kind of interesting, they would have just completely ignored my request. But as soon as I could say, well, it really points to this executive's goals, they couldn't do it fast enough. I'm a big believer that you're better out being out front, that you're much better off leading the effort than sort of waiting for someone else to do it and then essentially suffering with whatever they come along with. My boss is big on this. He would much rather have us out there, if there's a gap, fill it, and let someone else come along later and say, oh, you shouldn't have used that approach. Because it's like, well, hey, you weren't giving me an answer. We went out and solved that problem. If you've got a better way of doing it, let's talk about it. But 9 times out of 10, guess what? You're going to win if you get there first. You may have to play a little bit of retail politics, kind of work your way through the organization and figure out, all right, who can influence things? I learned this the hard way at a company I was at several years ago. I was trying to introduce testing. I was very desperately trying to bring in JUnit and things like that and finding massive resistance. I mean, shocking levels of resistance. The reason they weren't resonating with what I was saying is because I didn't have tenure in the organization. I hadn't been there long enough, basically. I was the new guy. What does the new guy know? Well, I found a guy, Jason, good friend of mine, who did have tenure. And I started whispering in Jason's ear. Got Jason fired up about it. So then Jason went and carried that torch. And literally, exact same message I was giving coming out of Jason's mouth. People, were standing and applauding, and they couldn't do it fast enough. Now, from one standpoint, I feel kind of bad about that, because it's like, well, I didn't get the credit for it. But you know what? I still accomplished what I wanted to accomplish. We got more testing. Things got better. Take people out for coffee. Go grab some lunch. It is stunning to me what happens when you eat with someone, when you take them out for coffee, buy them a cup of coffee. Isn't that expensive? It changes the dynamics. There's an argument to be made that we should dine regularly with our coworkers. Some companies do this. Lunch is brought in every day, and that's a big part of the company culture is we sit down at lunch together as a company and eat together because it gets us out of this mentality of we're all just resources. I've got a good friend of mine who's in one of our main office out in Hartford. He and I work much better together because we both play golf. And when Cam comes to town, he brings his golf clubs and we go play golf together. And so now he and I have a much deeper relationship because when we're in a meeting together or if we're on a project together, it's like we can talk about something that isn't work related. And Cam is willing to do stuff for me that he isn't maybe willing to do for somebody else because I'm one of his golf buddies. There's something to be said for that. So a lot of these things, guys, they start grassroots. They work their way up. And the challenge for you is to do everything you can to make that visible. Now sometimes, occasionally, you have to channel this woman. Anybody know who she is? Yeah, what'd she invent? COBOL. Remember, it's the common business language. See, I don't want any programmers anymore. We're doing that forever. She's got a great quote. I absolutely love it. It is easier to ask for forgiveness than it is to get permission. Now, you got to understand your organization. I mean, there are some organizations for which, oh, you didn't get permission? Bye. But in most cases, if you're successful, you might get chewed on a little bit, but they're probably going to look the other way. So sometimes that's what we have to do. Go out there, do it, prove it, see what happens. I brought Hudson into our company. This was back before we renamed it to Jenkins, or named it to Jenkins, I should say. And I had a manager who was on my case about that. She was really upset with me for bringing that in, because she's like, that's not the standard tool, and how dare you do that? And it's like, yep, but it's going to be. And sure enough, 6 months later, it was the standard tool in our company. People usually don't argue with success, usually. Now, to wrap this up, what I would challenge you guys to do is change your organization. It's an important part of what we do. They have to evolve. But sometimes what that really means we have to do is change our organization. I'm not suggesting you all go quit your jobs tomorrow, but life is short. If you're not having fun, if it's not working in the direction you want it to work in, there's a lot of opportunities out there. And I think it is incumbent upon us as senior people to be agents of change in organizations. And I would much, much rather be the person who's helping to lead that effort, bring forward the things that I think are important, than to be stuck with whatever other people want to make me use. Now, I say that, and I do stress you need to understand the politics of your organization. Some organizations are very forgiving of failure, others are not, and you need to understand how that actually plays out in your current environment and adapt accordingly. But I'll leave you with this, guys. It is supposed to be fun. So have fun and enjoy yourself. Questions, comments, theories, queries? Did you guys have a good week? Awesome. Well, thank you so much for spending some time with me. I really appreciate it. Enjoy your evenings.